Thanks very much. I just want to speak really briefly here because both the process and the content of TILMA has, I think, is not always in the best interests of Alberta. The process particularly. And a number of people have spoken at length about that, the fact that Albertans were not allowed to be consulted in this, that in fact the agreement itself never came before this House, which I think is a real insult to all of the people that elected us to be here, to not even give duly elected people here representing folks the opportunity to comment on this agreement. It was really pretty shabby. And as I watch these various bills come through that are to implement TILMA and give the government the tools that it feels it needs to adhere to the various parts of the agreement, frankly, the hairs on the back of my neck are starting to go up, because there's just some stuff in here that does not sit right. And one of the things that has, first of all, let's look at this process of today. Prior to when the standing orders were changed at the insistence of the government, because I certainly didn't agree to it, this would have been considered an omnibus bill, because we're looking at amending agricultural finances, Agriculture Financial Services Act, Business Corporations Act, the Cooperatives Act, the Charitable Fundraising Act, and the Government Organization Act, all of those. And yet, members are restricted to 15 minutes and whatever use they can make of the 29(2)(a) provision. So some of the things that are starting to come off the page for me is particularly around what I'm seeing in the Government Organization Act. And I would like to get some answers back about this because, and this was brought to my attention by by my colleague from Edmonton Strathcona. But it looks to me, and I'd like to get the answers back on this one, as though Cabinet can make regulations that relate to the implementation of this agreement, and if as part of that they believe that they need to suspend or modify a provision of an act or a regulation, they can do so under this act. So in other words, Cabinet would then have the power under regulation, which, as we all know, happens behind closed doors, is not debated in this House, and the people have no say in it, in which case this Cabinet would be able to go and modify an act of this legislature by regulation behind closed doors, so that what we have done in this Assembly would be undone by Cabinet behind closed doors. And that, I would argue, is very undemocratic. More than that, it appears in the next section that it can do that retroactively. So without our concurrence in this House, without the input of a number of you members here, these changes could be made to an act, actually change an act of legislation, and make it retroactive back to April 1st of 2007. How do you like them bananas? Let's say you're operating out there under an act of this Assembly. You're doing your business, you're adhering to the law exactly the way it's written, and bingo, presto bingo, this thing passes, and all of a sudden you're illegal because you weren't supposed to be doing what you were doing, even though at the time you did it, it said you could, because the government, the Cabinet, behind closed doors, has now changed what is possible. So I am happy to be corrected on this one. I would be delighted to be corrected on this one. But it sure looks to me like that's what's happening. And whoever's getting lippy over there, you can get up and start making these justifications about how you would interpret this differently. But it's saying the Lieutenant Governor and Council can make regulations in respect to this matter to suspend the application of or modify a provision of an act or regulation, or may substitute another provision in place of a provision, and then may specify circumstances in which a suspension or a modification of or a substitution for a provision of an act or regulation provided for is to operate. So it can change it, take it away, put in a new version, and it's a done deal. And it never came through this House. And that, I think, I would argue, and then maybe I'll go back and start to look, but I would have called that a contempt of this House. to be able to have Cabinet make it through a regulation, change a piece of legislation. Legislation that's made here comes back here. It doesn't get fiddled around with behind closed doors by members of Cabinet who are trying to adhere to an international agreement. So I am looking very much forward to having some answers back on this one. And this same regulation goes on with a number of other sections. But to me, this is very problematic. Aside from all the other problems that we have with TILMA about being able to make sure that our workers, a number of them have raised concerns with me that, their higher standards will now, of certification for work would now be lower, and all those other issues we've heard brought up around TILMA. Aside from all of that stuff, what I just described is truly horrifying. What's next? We don't even come into this House and Cabinet can change anything once behind closed doors, because that's the essence of what I'm hearing here. So I absolutely cannot accept in principle what is before us in this bill today. And I will look forward to continued debate and from additional information from the sponsor of this bill. But I'm sure not liking what I'm seeing here. Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker.